So let's if it's an okay time, let's now talk about the treasure digging. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about, give us the background on treasure digging and what that was all about and how that ended up creeping into what Joseph Smith did. Because I kind of feel like treasure digging is where Mormonism started.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So give us the background of treasure digging so we understand. It wasn't just silly folk magic that Joseph Smith was involved in. Wasn't it a way to make money when you're poor?
Well, okay. There's this whole business of money digging, and I really looked into it. And the other scholar who did so much research on that is Richard Brooke.
But also Michael Quinn, right? He wrote
Michael Quinn,
Joseph
Early
Smith
Magic Worldview, yes. Right. And Richard L. Brooke and the origination of Mormon cosmology. The money digging, some people have said, and I'm not sure if Michael Quinn said this, but, it was a spiritual quest. Well, not when you really look into it.
And that's what Richard Bushman tries to say as well, that the early stuff Joseph Smith did with the Pierce Stone was Joseph trying to figure out how to get revelation from God.
No.
So tell us what let's start by talking about the cultural factors that would make treasure digging even possible, kind of the superstitious
stuff.
Well, the pirate stuff, Captain Kidd stuff, right? Was that all involved?
Yeah, there was a man named William Kidd who was hung as a pirate late 1790s. And
Where was he hung?
In the Barbary Coast. Well, he had been hung as a pirate over there. I'm not sure where he's hung. I'd have to look that up.
Caribbean or like in the U.S.?
But it was a big
England, like generally?
No, he was an American. I believe he was a pirate. I'm not an expert on William Kidd, but I know that he was, hung as a pirate. It was a political battle. Some people didn't believe that he had been guilty of being a pirate, but he was convicted. But there was this legend that lasted for 150 years that he had buried his treasure somewhere in the wilderness or somewhere hidden on the east coast of America.
Okay. That's how it's tied to America.
He was hung in London.
Okay,
he was hung in London. So,
but the treasure was supposed to have been buried.
Right, he buried his treasure. Where had he buried this huge treasure that he'd stolen as a pirate? And there were all kinds of rumors of where he had, and buried it.
And was there a book?
So,
wasn't there a book? Because there's that map that shows Cumorah and Moroni in the map.
Yeah, the Cumorah Islands and Moroni.
Wasn't that in a Captain Kidd book? That's what I understood.
There might have been. Grant Palmer did more.
Okay, you don't know about that part.
He did a whole article on the pirate and, the Cumorah Islands and Moroni and where he got some of the names.
And the only reason I mention that is because if Joseph Smith, it seems like if Joseph Smith knew about this Kidd guy from reading the book, and the book happened to have the word Moroni and Cumorah in it. Yeah, those are all sort of important things.
Think there
and if
was
the treasure
a book.
digging was so anyway, but you don't know about that book.
Well, I think I have heard about that, but I didn't go into that.
Okay, that's fine.
Area very much.
So listeners, that's something we'll follow up in a different interview because I think that's a really important piece. But
I know that this
legend of a buried treasure in America.
There were people like Ransford Rogers, who was a distant cousin of Joseph Smith and who came out of the Rogerines, which was a radical sect, in Connecticut. And we can trace exactly where he came from and everything. He developed this idea that you can get farmers to invest. He would have these specific methods, and people, I found this quite a bit in the 19th century. People who had been ripped off by these con artists wanted to warn their fellow citizens about them. So they would describe exactly their behavior and publish these pamphlets. And that happened a lot in Mormonism. So there's all this, quote, anti-Mormon literature. A lot of it's exposés of people that had been ripped off or else that had been inside that wanted to warn their fellow citizens. So there was a pamphlet described exactly what Ransford Rogers did. And he would gather this group of farmers that had money, and tell them that there was buried treasure on their property. He knew right where it was, but the ghosts that were guarding it had to be appeased, and you had to do all these rituals. You had to hold these midnight seances. You had to do exactly what the prophet or the conjurer said exactly right to get it, so that the ghosts would give up their guardianship of this treasure and the farmers could get it. Well, this would, first you'd have to gain their confidence, charm them, and of course you have to look in your magic stone, or you get the revelation from the paper dropping out of heaven, or they had all kinds of means of convincing people that they had supernatural powers. And Ransford Rogers did this in Morristown, New Jersey. So, and then that's exactly the methods that Joseph Smith used later in New York. And it was also similar to what they did in the word scrape group. So it would take place over months or even years, where the farmers would pay the expenses of these con artists, and they would hold these seances, and they were just about to get the treasure, but they did something wrong with the ritual, so then they had to do it over again. And
that was a way for them to make money, to con people out of money, but they also had to build into it the ability to keep them believing that they had special powers, even though they were never finding anything.
Right.
Is that right?
And this could only go along for so long before there wasn't any treasure found, and they would be found out. And then they had to have an escape hatch. They had to have some way of explaining why there was never where there wasn't a treasure, and they had to be able to get the money and get out of town. And that's what Ransford Rogers did. He conned those farmers out of big amounts of money.
It would have been thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And these digs were big digs, right? Like the holes were
huge, 100 feet down. They'd have to dig some more. Well, we just barely got the treasure, but then it slipped down, or they'd have some story as to why they couldn't get the treasure. And like Ransford Rogers conned his group of farmers out of 500 pounds sterling. A lot of them mortgaged their farms. They sold their cattle at half price in order to appease those ghosts. And then he absconded with, hundreds, or would have been thousands of dollars, now $25,000.
And so as you're saying this, I'm thinking Hill Cumorah, I'm thinking Angel Moroni, I'm thinking golden plates and sword of Laban and buried treasure. It almost seems like the way Mormonism begins is as Joseph's trying to come up with a historical story for convincing others that they should invest in some sort of endeavor to uncover buried treasure. He's coming up with names and artifacts, and he's putting it in a hill, and he's naming the angel, and he's starting to think about a story that maybe he could convince other people to believe.
He got very good at being persuasive. And he practiced this kind of money digging scam for over 7 years.
From 1823-ish to...
No, from 1819 to 1827.
So before he would have had the first vision, he was already engaging in this type of behavior.
Well, Dan Vogel traced the 18 sites in Susquehanna County and in upper state New York, Manchester area, and Palmyra. He dug, he scoured old documents and he traced at least 18 places where he had dug these big holes and got people to invest in him and pay his expenses. And then there was the huge, dubious scandal where Oliver Harper, his money-digging employer, was murdered, and I covered that in my one whole chapter of my book.
It was almost something to the effect of, we're not finding the treasure. The spirits demand a sacrifice. Someone needs to die. Is that kind of?
Yeah, that was one of the most scandalous, clients that he had. And that was in 1820. Well, he worked for him from 1822 to 1824. And it was in Susquehanna County, away from Manchester, New York. But Isaac Hale and Elizabeth, Emma's parents, were right in the thick of that. And you know that they were because it's in the trial records of Oliver Harper, where his convicted murderer, Jason Treadwell, lived next door to Isaac and Elizabeth Hale. Joseph Smith worked for Oliver Harper just across the river in Broome County. And it's this whole horrendous story of how his employer was murdered. And there's stories that the money digging group, because he'd already, Harper had spent $2,000 and he said, I'm not going to pay the money diggers anymore. The money diggers were boarding and living at Isaac and Elizabeth Hale's house. So when Isaac Hale said that he first met Joseph Smith in 1825, not true. It's another story. He wanted to distance himself by that time, by 1831, when he wrote that affidavit. No, he was in the thick of this whole counterfeiting mess because 11 people at Jason Treadwell's trial testified that Jason Treadwell was dealing in counterfeit money, including Levi Lewis, Emma's first cousin, who lived right down the way. He knew all about the counterfeiting that was going on amongst, this group. And so then, funny thing, then there's this other rumor came out that the money digging group was asking for a human sacrifice. They had to have an escape hatch,
whenever the treasure can't be found, there needs to be an escape hatch.
Well, and Oliver Harper may well have been preparing to go to the law and telling about either the counterfeiting. I gave all this
money and they're not producing a treasure. It's illegal.
Right. But he may have been in on the counterfeiting too because his son, we have a bench warrant for him for counterfeiting. So as I said, the Woods Creek group was a cover group for counterfeiters, and they were getting revelations through mineral rods, supposedly for a fee.
And what's important about that is Oliver Cowdery's father was part of the Woodscrape group, right? Is that right?
And so was Joseph Smith Sr.
Yeah, so now we have Oliver Cowdery's dad and Joseph Smith's dad involved in all of this weird treasure digging, possibly counterfeiting stuff. And it sort of sets the stage for the younger generation to come along.
Exactly.
Because that's the environment that Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith grew up in, were these parents that were doing charlatan-like, fraudulent, superstitious, and potentially even illegal activities.
Well, they were illegal. Yeah. It was illegal to charge people a fee for stealing their property and then supposedly finding it. Yeah, that was against the law. And because it's swindling. They knew full well that they didn't have supernatural powers.
Yeah. So it wasn't like the way that I was told, Oliver Cowdery just kind of stumbles into wherever Joseph was living in 1829 and just jumps in and helps translate the Book of Mormon. But no, it's more like Oliver's dad and Joseph's dad were intimately involved in all sorts of weird, supernatural, illegal, fraudulent stuff, possibly for, generations back. Right?
Yeah. Well, if you can go back to look at Asel Smith and Solomon Mack, and they even said they were surrounded by counterfeiters during the Revolutionary War, and they lived in the places where a lot of people were arrested, a lot of counterfeiting activity. So it probably started with the grandfathers.
It's just families of shady behavior, right? On both sides.
Well, yeah, and the money digging was intimately connected with counterfeiting. I mean, it was these radical sects that purported to get revelations to tell you how to do your business, to tell you how, magic revelations from mineral rods that would tell you, for a fee you could find out. It was kind of like fortune telling. You should do this and this and this and this with your business, or sell your farm, or people wanted to know that.
So there was kind of supernatural fortune-telling, superstitious stuff interwoven in the treasure digging and the counterfeit.
And the radical sects, that
Right.
purported to be getting revelations as prophets.
And then you're mentioning the terms priesthood, millennium, and temple also being interwoven into these sorts of groups.
Well, there was a man named Reverend Laban Clark and an attorney.
Laban?
His name was Laban Clark.
Laban.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Laban. Okay.
That's someone they would have known if, in the wood scrape group.
Right.
Because he was right there in the midst of it. And he wrote a long, detailed description of what he observed had happened. And then this firsthand, and same with this attorney named Barnes Frisbee, who interviewed 40 people in that area in the wood scrape group, or that had known about it. He wrote down exactly what people said too. So we have pretty good records of, firsthand observers that saw what happened. And yet, William Cowdery Jr., Oliver's father, was observed to have, this major counterfeiter, Justice Winchell, living at his house. Now unless you're in an oath-bound secret, group, you don't hang around with counterfeiters. You don't house them in your house because you're an accessory to crime.
But talk about the words priesthood, millennium, and temple. Why would those be used in a counterfeiting context?
There was a man named Wood, Nathaniel Wood, who started this radical sect. He wasn't allowed to preach, because he wasn't licensed, didn't know the languages. He wanted to start a sect himself and get revelations. So he formed this wood scrape group that started getting revelations as to how, they'd meet in their houses, they'd have these meetings, and they would get people's money for getting revelations through the mineral rods as to what they should do in their lives. And so this went on for 2 years, and they were that any time the millennium's going to come, so you need to do this and this and this with your business. One of his sons was named, they called him, his nickname was Priest Wood, because his last name is Wood. But they had their order of priesthood, and this was, the Masons were the first ones to really have the Melchizedek priesthood. So they kind of borrowed that. So the Melchizedek priesthood was in this wood scrape group. And then they got a revelation that they were supposed to build a temple, but then the mineral rods reversed themselves on that. So they used a lot of this same, language.
So Joseph and Oliver and their parents and probably their grandparents, in their superstitious treasure digging, counterfeiting sort of culture, would have also been using words like Melchizedek priesthood, millennium, and temple.
And they called themselves the New Israelites, which meant they were descended from the Jews. And that was another thing that the Mormons claimed, is that their lineage went back to the Jews, So that was another thing.
And what all of this does is it helps us understand the historical and cultural context from which Joseph Smith and Mormonism sprang, right?
Yeah.
We're starting to see all the influences. Joseph becomes this sponge, the bricolage, if you want to call it that. But he's basically just remixing, taking all these different influences, aggregating them together.
Yeah.
And then doing what his parents and ancestors and all these other charlatans basically did. He just ended up doing it better than anybody else.
He was one of the most successful at being one of the, radical sect prophets.
So let's go to Joseph Smith's treasure digging. You mentioned that he did it for at least 7 years, from age 14 to 21, 1819, 1826.
Yeah.
This becomes, the Smith family is poor. Joseph Smith Sr. is an alcoholic, is that right?
Right.
He's not gainfully employed. They're relying on Alvin and then eventually Hyrum to be the main breadwinners in the family, because Joseph's still relatively young. Is that right?
Right.
And so
But he started when he was 14, and from age 14 to age 21, he got very skilled at conning farmers into paying him.
But the question would be, why that? And it seems like it would be a combination of that's what their parents and grandparents were doing, but also they're living in the frontiers of New York, and they have to make money, they have to eat, they have to pay their rent, right?
Right.
And so treasure digging doesn't it become their way of making money?
Well, Joseph Smith Sr. was quoted by Vermonters as saying that he was going to teach his sons how to see out of a magic stone from the time when they were born. So we know that he wanted to teach Joseph Smith Jr. how to do that, like Ransford Rogers had, like Stephen Burroughs.
So Joseph Smith was sort of groomed to be this seer-peeping quasi-prophet.
Yeah, he was taught
charlatan.
in those methods from when he was very young. And Lucy said that she wanted a prophet to come out of their family. And even their grandfather, Asel Smith, said that he wanted, he was looking forward to when a, quote, prophet was going to come out of their family.
And what did they mean by that?
Well, they meant a leader of a radical sect that did away with the main pillars, you might say, of Protestant Christianity. Protestant Christianity believes in faith alone, through Scripture alone, in Christ alone, by grace alone, not adding anything to it. But, you could get a following, you could get people to believe you and obey you and be a front group for counterfeiting if you were a radical sect leader. So they groomed him to be one of those from very early on, back in Vermont.
So he was groomed to be a peepstone searing kind of prophet, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he saw these different examples and he used a lot of their ideas.
And his parents wanted him to be that, right?
Yeah, they were estranged from both the Christians and the Masons. At least it looked to me like, because they didn't belong in Christian society because they're doing all the occult and the swindling, and the Masons wouldn't really accept them either. And those were the two main.
Hyrum was a
groups.
Mason, but Joseph Smith Sr. wasn't accepted. Isn't that right?
Well, that's what there's a question about Joseph Smith Sr., but there's no question. I mean, it's pretty clear that he really struggled with alcoholism, and he didn't buckle down to a trade or make money. He was a peddler. The not William Bennett, but the newspaper man interviewed 35 different people, and they all said he was a peddler in Vermont, not a farmer. Lucy said in her history that, we were farmers, and we buckled down to the farm in New York. No. The neighbors all said they didn't clear the land. They never did pay for the land. We know that. They never owned any land. And they didn't do, the neighbors said they didn't do their farming. They didn't do that. The typical pattern was to article for the land, plant your crops, sell it, and pay off the debt within a year or two. Never did pay for the land. And there's the whole... So anyway, but you couldn't make a lot of money during the swindling. You could only get your expenses paid,
It was subsistence level.
It was a kind of subsistence level.
But it's probably funner than hard work. I mean, it's funner than digging. I mean, it's funner than, clearing a field and planting crops and harvesting, right? I don't know.
Right. 90% of people at that time were farmers, and it was hard work. But there were these disorderly, troublemaking imposter people that went from place to place, were transient, got involved in these occult activities and swindling, and they were very associated with passing counterfeit money as well. So
so really quickly, we talked about the early treasure seekers and the tactics that they would use to convince people that there was treasure and to manipulate them. Did Joseph Smith do that same sort of behavior? Talk about, I remember Grant Palmer talking about a sacrifice being needed to be made, like some type of animal sacrifice. Weren't there late night sort of expeditions? Did Joseph ever take an article, hide it, and then tell people that he had found it. Like, talk about Joseph's actual involvement in the treasure digging and the tactics that he has documented to have used that might be troubling or alarming to people.
Well, one of the main sources is History of Susquehanna County by Susan Blackman, and she was a very well-respected historian. She wrote a detailed account of her county and the history, and she described in there some of the rituals and the things that he did.
That Joseph Smith did.
Yeah, that Joseph Smith was, and his buddies, his oath-bound group that. And there's all the different names. I mean, there was the Sheriff McCune. He fell in under Joseph Smith's wiles. He became a client for a while. There's a big hole on his property. Well, and Arthur Deming was, his father had been sheriff in Nauvoo. He went back to Susquehanna County and got all these testimonies of people that had known Joseph Smith and his father and Hyrum and Joseph, and they all describe, that Susan Blackman even made a map of some of the holes that they had dug and for treasure, all the different clients that he had. So we have pretty good records actually of.
Do you have a sense for if Joseph Smith Sr. was involved in the treasure digging?
Oh, yeah.
And how about Alvin and Hyrum?
They were all seen in Susquehanna County digging for money. And Martin Harris even said that. He said, oh, yes, Joseph and Hyrum and, Alvin, while he was alive, that's what their main occupation was. And I guess they didn't ever make a big heist like Ransford Rogers. He got 500 pounds sterling. They just mainly got their expenses paid, but they did it for a long time. And so there was Josiah Stoll was one of his main clients, and he was said to have spent $6,000 on the money diggers, and he never did turn against Joseph Smith. Oliver Harper apparently did, and they had to, he got murdered, but they describe in these descriptions exactly the same methods that Ransford Rogers has used. Such as midnight saying, you get the investors first, and we even an actual agreement, a money digging agreement, and Isaac Hale and David Hale are on this agreement, and this was after the murder of Oliver Harper, which really surprised me, because they were still willing to make agreements with Joseph Smith and the money diggers. After this man had been murdered, that's pretty curious. But people get all the investors to, pay up.
Get a bunch of investors who have money,
right, to pay your expenses.
And you sign some agreement where the investors put up the money.
Yeah, okay. and then they agree, if treasure's found, then we will pay you this much,
some percentage of the take. Okay.
And then you hold these seances at midnight, from midnight to 3 a.m., and the alcohol would flow freely, but you had to
So you're getting people drunk, which makes them susceptible to being manipulated.
Right. And then you conjure the ghosts. So you have to do these rituals where you sacrifice the blood of animals or drip them all in a circle, or hold this, make 4 different poles and then have a roof over it. And then you had to go around in a circle chanting this certain, phrase, or, they got it out of the occult books that they brought over from England. And this was a whole underground movement, of the occult, that it was even spread by John Dee, one of Elizabeth I's officers. So that, it was, the occult was spreading through these kind of books, and a lot of them have been found among the Mormons.
And so Joseph would have
so-
used these tactics in his treasure digs.
Yeah, but he knew that there wasn't, he would have known that that he couldn't really see in the stone to see any treasure, or that the rituals weren't really going to conjure the ghost, you're delving in the occult, and who knows what kind of influences, you would get.
But what's most important is, if we're trying to understand the context, what Joseph gained the skill to do was to give other people the impression that he had supernatural power.
Yeah.
And to figure out how to get them to continue believing in him, even when he continually was never able to actually produce treasure.
Right.
And that's the skill that he developed over those years, 1819, 1826. He developed the ability to convince people that he had power, supernatural power, and to somehow, when the treasure didn't get found, to do whatever he had to do so that they would keep believing in him. And isn't that the history of Mormonism? From 1830 to 1844, there's getting kicked out of New York. Kirtland Bank, kicked out of Kirtland. Missouri, all the promises, the Zion's camp, right? Kicked out of Missouri. Now they're going to Nauvoo. Now there's polygamy. Now he's declaring himself king of the world. All these prophecies that he makes saying this, that, or the other is going to happen. The prophecies often don't even come to pass.
Right.
Right?
But he just comes up with a new revelation.
And so this ability to convince people he had power, to make promises, and then when the promises don't come through, to somehow convince people to keep believing in him, that's what he learned through treasure digging, that he just converted to religion once he actually started the actual church. I mean, that's the theory that I'm operating under after reading your book.
Well, he was very adept at just painting this amazing picture of, he'd convince the farmers of this amazing treasure. He'd get them to see that in their minds. He could paint pictures in people's imaginations. And he did the same thing with the kingdom of God in Ohio. This is going to be this amazing city that is going to have the temple, and it's going to have this, and you're all going to be wealthy, and we're going to be up in heaven. And, he had this amazing imagination and ability to convey that in other people's minds. Yeah, you have to say
and
that.
Play on people's fears of death, on concerns about the afterlife, about the imminent coming of Christ, about the desire to make a lot of money, right? About influence.
Well, and people said that they covered up their crimes. The Palmyran neighbors in their immediate vicinity said that people nearby them often found, came up with stolen property. Their sheep would be stolen, or their cattle, or their, but they'd send the sheriff out to their cabin, and the door would be locked, and they wouldn't be able to find anybody. So it wasn't, but then they would be able to talk this religious language so easily, and they'd tell you a bold-faced lie, but talk about angels and heaven and using this gift for only godly purposes, whatever, seeing through the stone. So they really studied using the religious language along with what they were doing.
How to control and influence people.
How to bold-faced lie. I mean, people said, they'd look you in the face, wouldn't flinch, and tell you something that was completely false. So,
right.
Well, and then Joseph Jackson later said it was his ability to tell really convincing lies that was his success.
And Jackson was related to Joseph how?
Well, Jackson was his intimate friend for over a year in Nauvoo, and his aide-de-camp, his real estate agent, intimate person.
And he said Joseph was just a good liar.
Oh, he said he was a very good liar, yeah.
Okay, so going back, I think it's, and this is going to be obvious to some, but maybe not to others, it's really important to understand Emma comes into the picture. We've already talked about the Hales, but it's really important to understand Josiah Stoll had some silver mine that he wanted to try and excavate. It wasn't a real silver mine, right? Like, how does Joseph meet Emma? And to what extent is treasure digging involved, not only in Joseph meeting Emma, but also in their eventual marriage, in terms of him having to escape, to elope, because Joseph had turned off Emma's dad so terribly based on these treasure digging activities? Maybe just paint that picture a tiny bit.
Well, the story, looking at Emma, their families went way back together.
The Hales and the Smiths?
Hales, well, Michael Quinn traced them back to the Woodsgrape group. They were living right on the border of Vermont, across from Middletown. And they were early on settlers of Susquehanna County, the Hales. So Emma and Joseph knew each other at least from Susquehanna County, when Oliver Harper was murdered, and before that, because they were living they were all living there in Harmony, Pennsylvania. The Hales and her relatives, their relatives, and Joseph Smith across living with Oliver Harper. So they knew each other since at least 1822, 1823, and then they didn't get married till 1827. But, well, that's a question. When did Isaac Hale finally wake up and realize that he wanted to distance himself from the money diggers? Because
what was going on with Josiah Stoll, the silver mine, and the Hales and Joseph? So just talk about that.
Josiah Stoll was a little bit later with the money digging, but this, the Hales and Joseph Smith were in the thick of that whole trial with Jason Treadwell, and up to he gets killed in 1824. No. Well, Josiah Stoll came in the picture 1825 and later.
So talk about that.
Well,
what was Joseph doing around Emma at that time? Why was he even there? What was Josiah Stoll, Joseph Smith, and the Hales? Why were they together? What was happening? I just want to remind people about that.
Well, it's hard. It's a little bit hard to piece together because they tried to keep it hidden, but I would say we know the most about it because of the Oliver Treadwell trial. The trial records had them all located there together, and so after 1820, there's the murder. Then Alvin Smith is murdered 1824 too, and there's a whole chapter in my book on that. That could have been some kind of retaliation. And then
because he was poisoned, possibly poisoned.
Yeah, well, the accounts we have of it from Lucy and any other, the main account is from Lucy. She said that the doctor, an unknown doctor from somewhere else, she didn't even know his name, came and forced him to drink this calomel as supposed to be a medicine, but it was actually mercury. It was touted as a medicine, but if you took too much of it, you would die, and that's what happened. And they made statements later that Lucy and Joseph Sr., they wrote down that they believed their son had been murdered. So, you don't know, but it looks awfully suspicious. And you can read my evidence yourself and make up your own mind. But so we don't know a whole lot about the periods from after Jason Treadwell was murdered to, we do know about Alvin, but then we have 1826 when the anti-Masonry starts and Joseph Smith gets arrested as a disorderly person and an imposter. So now, and that was in Susquehanna County. So we know he was still hanging around in Susquehanna County, swindling people, living near the Hales, where Emma was, and her cousins, at least up until 1826. And then he's arrested, and he can't go there except in the shadows.
And he's arrested for what?
For he was arrested under the vagrancy laws, which say that you cannot just move from place to place, have swindling people and looking in your magic stone, charging them a fee for telling where the lost, stolen, or property is. It's, it must have been not that uncommon because it was right in the laws that say there's laws against this. This is illegal. You can't be swindling people doing this. So he was
basically involved in illegal activities for 7 straight years.
Oh yeah,
it finally caught up with him in 1826,
right,
where he goes to court.
Well, and interestingly, what these swindlers would do, like Joseph Smith, they would get the law enforcement officers in on the deal. They would convince the law enforcement, the sheriff, and there was a sheriff in Susquehanna County that signed the money digging agreement, Sheriff Wiley. So they would corrupt the law enforcement to convince them they would, get some of the treasure too. But that didn't, finally, Peter Bridgman was one of the relatives of one of the farmers that they were swindling, so he prosecuted Joseph Smith Jr. for being a disorderly person and imposter, and what they call a juggler, which means you're swindling people. And he went to trial. He did not go to trial. He actually went before a judge, and they did determine in the hearing that there was enough evidence to hold him over for trial. Yes, he was doing that, but they covered it over with religious language, Smith Sr. And then he was let out on, quote, leg bail, which was a counterfeiting term, which meant that just as long as you stay away from our vicinity, you can go free. And that happened a lot in law enforcement in early America. They didn't have very good jails. It was expensive to house a prisoner.
Because you had to feed him and
you just run the person out of town. Just don't come back to our town, and just stay out of town. That's your punishment. You have to pay bail, and then go to another jurisdiction, and some other sheriff has to deal with you.
So by 1826, Joseph's like, I'm probably not going to be able to keep doing this treasure digging thing.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Right. They were getting too well known around there, according to William Smith, his brother. They were becoming too known as swindlers. And I traced that Abner Cole probably was one of his clients that got swindled out of a lot of money, because he lost a lot of property right around 1824-25, right before he got, Smith got arrested. And that's why he had a motive to publish all this money digging material in the Reflector right before the Book of Mormon was coming out, because he'd been swindled by those guys.
Right. So all these people that were derided as anti-Mormons were really people who had been fooled, who were trying to tell the truth to keep others from being fooled.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the best evidence we have against Joseph Smith, we should look to these anti-Mormon sources, because they're actually probably the most credible people who can tell what actually happened.
Well, it took a lot of time, money, and expense to publish anything back then. So why would they do that unless they were telling the truth and wanting to warn their fellow citizens?
Right.
So.
Okay, so by 1826, Joseph's realizing, okay, treasure digging's had a nice 7-year run, but I'm not going to be able to keep that up, right?
Right.
But he had in his mind the idea of a book, I'm guessing, right?
Well,
because of Ethan Smith, because of Solomon Spaulding, because of that other dude, Stephen Burroughs. It's like, well, I can't make money off the treasure digging. Maybe I can make money off of a book. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but.
It looks like it was a lot Lucy's idea. She had been hanging around at Dartmouth as well and picked up a lot of the ideas. And her husband, of course, is out with wine, like it says in one of the Revelations. And so she has to come up with some way. So she was kind of the instigator and the idea person. She helped in a lot of ways, but the other real motivation was the anti-Masonic movement.
Okay, talk about that.
Okay, well, that's a long story, and I can, try to explain it. But as I said, there was this culture war from the beginning, very early, between the deist Masons and the evangelical Christians. So the Masons had their own rituals, and they say they're not a religion, but people that have left Masonry say that it is a religion.
It functionally serves the function of a religion.
Yeah.
It's a community. It's got stories and narratives and myths. It's got a moral code.
Right.
It serves the function of a religion for those who are intimately involved in it.
But it's secret, and it had gotten a lot of political power by this time. They said that, or the researchers that I consulted said that maybe prior to when the common man, the rise of the common man with Andrew Jackson and the more egalitarianism, it had been a small elite group and maybe 5% of the population. But then there was this schism within Masonry, and there was the upstate Masons that were more rural, and then there were the city Masons that wanted to keep it more elite. But they had this schism, and there was divisions within it. And there were two Masonic lodges between 1822 and 1827, and this played a big part in Mormonism. I discovered. I thought
Huge part.
Yeah, because the country Masons were being discriminated against. They felt on the basis of their class, and the elite urban Masons weren't. They were the ones that were discriminating. So there was the fact that Masonry had opened up more to the common man there, and Masonry's expanded all throughout the country. But there were these divisions. So in upstate New York, a man named William Morgan decided to infiltrate the Masons, or to expose their secrets. He was well known as a Mason. He knew all the rituals. And there's a whole long story about it. But anyway, the bottom line was he wrote this book exposing their secrets, but the Masons collaborated together to kidnap him and take him across the border to Canada, where he died, where he disappeared forever. And
he was killed, basically.
Yeah. Well, the Masons always denied that they killed him, but a body washed up on shore, and the coroner and the doctor and the dentist even identified this body as Morgan. And he was probably the person that was going to be the next leader of the Masons. He was going to lead his country Masons to be separate branch of Masonry than the city Masons. But this whole murder happened, and he published, they published his secrets anyway. This group that were egging him on, and I present a lot of evidence that Joseph and Hyrum Smith were connected with this William Morgan, and that maybe Alvin Smith was going to be the next leader of the country Mason wing of the Masons, but he got murdered or died, and then it looks like Joseph and Hyrum Smith together formed what people said was Joseph's Lodge after, during the year 1827 and subsequent to that. But there was no talk of any Golden Bible, anything else like that before 1827, and that's when they started working on this Book of Mormon project.
So Joseph and Hyrum together start thinking a lot about Masonry, secret ritual, covenants, oaths.
And that's when Lucy really started egging them to do that too. After the death of Alvin, they wanted it. It might have been connected with the Masons, and I can explain it. That I explain that why I think that, because the doctor that was supposed to have administered to Alvin was the head of the Royal Arch Masons in Palmyra. So it looks like they may have wanted to get revenge on the Masons.
But either way, Hyrum and Joseph they're starting to form a lodge in 1827?
Well, there's this huge division in the culture.
But how does that...
Because when William Morgan published The Secrets, there was a huge outcry. The Christians, most people were Christians of one stripe or another, and they saw that there were all these secret rituals and there were these promises to support each other, right or wrong, on pain of death, and these what looked like to them like Christian mockeries of, these rituals where you act out murders and then you are raised from the dead, and so it looked very suspicious, and a lot of the under level, the basic level Masons, the Blue Lodge they call them, who did not go up to the higher degrees, saw through the publishing of the Royal Arch Masonry Secrets and Rituals that they had been hoodwinked, as they called it. The rituals of Masonry did not go back to ancient times like they had been told. It had been invented by Charles Ramsey, or not Charles Ramsey, another person named Ramsey. So the huge numbers of people left the Masonic lodges and denounced it and told all the secrets and went around publishing pamphlets and turned against their former Royal Arch priests and kings, as they were called. And so what I'm thinking of
when I hear this, and it reminds me of conversation with Grant Palmer, if you look at all the language in the Book of Mormon about secret combinations, secret oaths, it seems like that's all language that's informed by the William Morgan affair and all the hullabaloo around Masonry. Wasn't that basically Grant Palmer's premise?
Well, and Dan Vogel did a whole article on identifying passages in the Book of Mormon that he said that he and other scholars have determined that refer directly to the Masons. And the Masons were a secret oath-bound group. And like Charles Finney, one of the main pastors that of the Second Awakening, who had been a Mason but left it, he said, you cannot believe someone who is under the secrecy oath as to what Masonry is, because they're bound to secrecy. They can't violate their oath by telling you the truth about what it is. You have to talk to either people that have left it, that are no longer bound by their oaths, or people that investigate it.
So when you think about the oaths you make in the temple to protect and defend and build up the church, even at the expense of your own life.
Yeah.
And you think about this idea of lying for the Lord, where Joseph Smith was lying to people about his polygamy, where the church was lying about post-manifesto polygamy, and all the different ways that we as a culture, even now to the sexual cover-up of sexual predators in the defense of sexual predators in modern day Mormonism, I wonder if it's too much of a stretch to sort of tie all that back to this idea of oath-bound secret groups sworn to secrecy, that's a legacy that maybe even Masonry is kind of handed to us in Mormonism. Is that too much of a stretch?
Well, it certainly was the practice of that time. There was the Masons who secretly oath-bound to each other, and you can read the actual oaths that they take. They're available. You can, and Masons even verify that those are the oaths that they took in the 19th century. And then, so actually, the anti-Mason Masonic movement and the Mormon movement give you a real good window onto actually what Masonry was of that time.
Yeah. So and all I'm saying is maybe we've inherited a lot more from Masonry than just the temple ceremony.
Oh, well, than
just the
for
artifacts.
instance, Marvin Hogan and other Masonic writers they say Mormonism and Masonry are intimately connected. You can't separate the two from their, with their origins. The two were, and people said that this is Joseph's Lodge, and there were other people that tried to put a Christian stamp on Masonry because all the lodges shut down. So then it left this big void.
With the William Morgan affair, lodges shut down.
Right.
So people were like, "Oh, I lost the Masonry."
Right. So now what am I going to do? And there were many that became Christians, and that's why they left Masonry, based on preaching from Charles Finney and other leaders of the Second Awakening. People were joining churches in large numbers, and so but there was this conflict between, what Christians believe versus what Masons believe. So you're either one or the other, but the Masons maybe made a mistake in inviting a lot of the Christian ministers to join the lodge for free, and because then they realized after being in the Masons and it was a seductive thing for them for a while, but then there was this huge movement against it, and it was spearheaded by the Christian ministers.
Yeah, and that's all important for me. I'm watching this series on Netflix. There's a really good series on Netflix about Masonry. It's like a 6-part series on the history of Masonry. And you don't realize it, but Masons build temples, right?
Yes.
What did Joseph want to do as soon as he got to Kirtland?
It became an obsession.
He wanted to build a temple. It's not, he didn't get that from God or the Bible. He got that because he's basically saying, let's merge Christianity and Masonry, because why is Masonry still popular? And it still is. That ritual is, the Masons that I've watched in that documentary say, Masonry would be kind of boring without the ritual, but we will really like the ritual. So Joseph gets this idea, let's build a temple, let's have these secret oaths and fellowships, let's have these rituals that all the members are involved in, because those are really good hooks that build community, that can be used to give people a sense of meaning and purpose, and that can be used to control people, right?
Yeah. So you have this culture war, and the Masons get exposed, and Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery may well have been.
Oliver was a Mason. I'm sorry. Yes. Hyrum was a Mason.
Yes, and so then he has this dilemma of, is he going to go with the Masons, or is he going to join all the hundreds of other Masons that are leaving Masonry because of whatever reason, because the general population turned against Masonry. I mean, they said, we don't want to vote for any Masons. We don't want to have any business contracts with Masons. We don't want our daughters even dating them. We don't want, we're going to shut down this organization. So people had to choose. Okay, am I going to go with the anti-Masons or go with the, just stay low a little while and remain adhering Mason? But it almost presaged the Civil War that was going to happen 40 years later, this anti-Masonic movement. And they formed a whole political movement, the anti-Masonic movement. It got a lot of attention. It forced both of the other political parties to pay attention. There was Solomon Southwick, who got elected governor, who was an anti-Mason and leader of the party. And the governor of Vermont Southwick got a large percentage of the vote. The governor of Vermont actually was in the anti-Masonic party, one of the leaders. So it shook up the whole political system, the whole culture. I mean, people were divided against each other very strongly. And funny enough, that's what Mormonism's born out of. All the lodges shut down, and that's when 1827, in the year after the William Morgan big, huge, murder and explosion, and this anti-Mason movement lasted for a good 5 years when all these people that had been implicated went to trial. So Joseph and Hyrum Smith attended a lot of these Morgan trials. They must have. It was happening right around where
And
they
Joseph
lived.
ended up marrying Morgan's ex-wife.
Yeah, his widow. And his Morgan's her partner, who was also most likely a counterfeiter, George W. Harris, they both joined the Mormons. They were actually married to each other, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan and George W. Harris. They joined the church in 1838, and very quickly, Lucinda Morgan becomes the plural wife of Joseph Smith.
Right.
And George W. Harris goes on to become one of his highest officers.
Right.
So,
yeah. Okay. So really quickly, I still want to go back and tie Emma to Joseph. I just think it's important, number one, that one of the main ways Emma and Joseph were exposed to each other was Joseph Smith's involvement in the Josiah Stoll money digging.
Well,
right?
it was more in the Isaac Hale money digging, because Isaac Hale was involved with the money digging.
Okay.
He in fact was paying according to Susan Blackman, he was paying the money diggers for quite a while,
Right.
until he finally woke up to it.
So somebody woke up to it and didn't like the money digging anymore. But by that time, I'm guessing Joseph had fallen in love with Emma,
Right.
or Emma had fallen in love with Joseph. So
Well, and William Law later on in Nauvoo said that Emma was his accomplice from the beginning. And so they were in on this whole scheme from the beginning. She must have been in on, just like Lucy was, and Emma and the whole family. And they had learned how to cooperate with each other because of their counterfeiting and their money digging, all that. So when the opportunity came up to form a competing organization to the Masons, then that's really spurred their idea of writing a book, because now they could put, it wouldn't just be a spurious history of the Native Americans. Now they could put all this other material in it, and they could start their own lodge.
And this reminds me of L. Ron Hubbard, because it's one thing to write fiction, and that's what Ethan Smith did, and that's what Solomon Spaulding did, and that's what L. Ron Hubbard did, right?
Yeah.
Wrote fiction.
Right.
But L. Ron Hubbard himself said, if you want to, get rich, start a business. If you want to get really rich, start a religion. And it must have been at some point Joseph and Hyrum and Emma and maybe Joseph's parents and the Cowdreys and whoever else realized, let's create the book, let's make money off the book, but then let's tie the book to a religion, and let's start a religion, and then let's see what type of money and power can be accumulated at that point. I don't know. That's a theory.
It looks like they started out just making a spurious history that they wanted to make money with. But then the anti-Masonic movement came along, and they said, and Martin Harris lost the first 116 pages as well.
Okay, wait, let's not get there yet. Just pause 1 second. Okay. So at some point, Emma and Joseph fall in love, but
right.
At what year?
Well, they got married in 1827.
Okay.
But they knew each other a long time before that.
But by that time, Isaac was cold on Joseph, right?
Well, we don't know when he turned against Joseph.
Well, what we know is that they didn't have some beautiful wedding ceremony in Emma's hometown, right?
Well, they eloped to...
They eloped. Why did they elope? Why did they elope? Why did they have to elope?
Well...
How did Emma's dad feel about the marriage?
We don't really know, because...
Didn't he hate Joseph?
But that was as of 1831. See, 1831, we already have the anti-Masonic movement going strong. And by this time, Joseph, they had gotten married in 1827. But this was Isaac Hale's affidavit where he says he's turned against Joseph. He said he distanced himself in that. See, this is what they had to do. If they had been involved in money digging, they didn't want the public to know. Whoever it was, like Abner Cole or Sheriff McCune or Isaac Hale, they denied it publicly, at least for a while. They didn't want the whole world to know that they had fallen for the tricks of the con artist. So in 1831, Isaac Hale says, no, I didn't know him before 1825. I just met him in 1825. No, they had already been involved in the whole Oliver Harper thing. Okay. So that's why he says, I don't like, I turned against the money diggers. Susan Blackman says, well, he turned against them at a certain point, but for a while he was paying them and housing them in his home.
Okay. But Joseph and Emma did elope.
Right, in 1827.
Okay.
But in 1828, Isaac Hale is letting them live on his property, and he's letting Reuben Hale, the brother, is helping him get up the characters. So when did he actually turn against them? Was it when, maybe
for you, that's a question.
Maybe it was when they eloped and he was mad about that, but we don't know exactly when he turned it. All we know is he distanced himself from the whole thing, and they were estranged after that. After he, Emma Hale did not communicate with her parents after she married Joseph Smith, or after they left for Ohio. But it's hard to sort out, actually.
And just to close off the money digging thing, Joseph, at some points in his history, sort of apologizes for that and promises, I'll get away from that, I'll stop doing it, I won't do it anymore.
Well, that's according to Isaac Hale's 1831 affidavit.
Right. And so that suggests, for those who want to say, like Richard Bushman, that those money digging years was just Joseph practicing his spiritual gifts and powers and trying to explore it. If that were the case, why would Joseph have to apologize for it later, right?
Right.
Like, it was illegal, fraudulent behavior. It was not Joseph developing his spiritual gifts.
Right. It was something that that anybody involved in it had to disavow.
Because it was illegal and disreputable and fraudulent and
they only did it at night, and they did it very secretively.